In 2154 BCE, the mightiest empire the world had ever seen collapsed in a matter of years. The Akkadian Empire, builder of cities, conqueror of nations, was brought to its knees, not by a rival power, not by an internal revolt, but by a people ancient scribes described as a mountain horde with human intelligence but canine instincts. Who were they? And how did a group the Sumerians called barbarians end up ruling Mesopotamia for almost 100 years?
From the ashes of the first great wars rise the names the world has lost. Every throne was built on blood and scars, every crown a final cost. These are the wars that time erased, the kings who ruled and were replaced. Written in stone, remembered in flame, the war archives reclaims their name.
They came from the mountains. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia called them the serpent and scorpion of the highlands. They described them as a people with human instincts but canine intelligence. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest political documents in human history, refers to their army as a force that knew no inhibition. For nearly a century, they held dominion over the ancient land of Sumer and Akkad, the cradle of civilization itself. Historians called their rule a dark age, a barbaric interlude, a catastrophe. But here's what those historians didn't ask. If it was such a dark age, why does this exist? That statue was carved during the supposed darkest point of the Gutian period, and it is one of the finest works of art ancient Mesopotamia ever produced. Someone has been lying to us, and that someone has been dead for 4,000 years. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel exists to do one thing: to take the stories we think we know about the ancient world and hold them up to the light until we can see what they were actually made of. And today we are going deep all the way back to the 22nd century BCE, to a people called the Gutians, and to one of the oldest propaganda campaigns in recorded history. Here is the traditional story. Around 2154 BCE, after the magnificent Akkadian Empire collapsed, mountain barbarians called the Gutians swept down into the Mesopotamian heartland. They destroyed cities, shattered civilization, and plunged the region into darkness for nearly a century until the heroic king, Utuhegel of Uruk, finally expelled them and restored order. It's a compelling story. It has heroes, villains, collapse, and restoration. It's also in large part a story that the victors wrote about themselves. In this video, we are going to examine every layer of that story: the primary sources, the archaeology, the scholarship, and the ideology. And by the end, I think you'll see the Gutian period very differently. Not as a dark age of barbaric destruction, but as something considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. Let's start at the beginning, the world the Gutians walked into. To understand the Gutian period, you first have to understand what the Gutians walked into. And what they walked into was the wreckage of something extraordinary. Around 2334 BCE, a man named Sargon seized power in the city of Akkad, a site we still haven't positively identified, and proceeded to conquer virtually every Sumerian city-state in southern Mesopotamia. Then he kept going. He pushed east into Elam, west toward the Mediterranean, north into Anatolia. Sargon of Akkad built what scholars recognize as humanity's first true territorial empire. His successors, particularly his grandson Naram-Sin, took this further. Naram-Sin called himself king of the four quarters of the universe and wasn't being entirely hyperbolic. He was deified in his own lifetime, the first Mesopotamian ruler we know to have demanded worship as a living god. The Akkadian Empire standardized weights, spread a common administrative language, and tied together a vast network of trade and tribute. But by around 2200 BCE, something was going catastrophically wrong, and understanding what gives us the essential context for everything that follows. The Akkadian collapse was not a single event. It was a convergence of crises, each feeding the others. The first, and arguably most important, was environmental. Paleoclimatic research, particularly Harvey Weiss's landmark work at Tel Lelan in northeastern Syria, has established that, around 2200 BCE, a severe drought struck the entire region. Weiss and his colleagues analyzed soil samples and found sudden increases in wind-blown dust and a dramatic collapse in agricultural yields. The city of Tel Lelan was simply abandoned. Other sites across northern Mesopotamia showed the same pattern: population flight, agricultural failure, the contraction of settlements into fewer, larger urban centers. This drought mattered because the Akkadian Empire's northern provinces were its breadbasket. Cut off from that agricultural surplus, the empire's ability to fund armies, pay administrators, and maintain loyalty began to unravel. Internal rebellions followed. The Sumerian cities of the south had never fully reconciled themselves to Akkadian hegemony. They had been conquered, and they remembered it. Inscriptions from the reign of Naram-Sin's successor Shaka-Shari, who ruled from approximately 2217 to 2193 BCE, record almost constant warfare against Elam to the east, against Amorite groups pressing from the Syrian steppe to the west, against rebellious cities throughout the Mesopotamian heartland. Read his inscriptions and you see a king fighting desperately on every front simultaneously. The man who claimed sovereignty over the universe was struggling to hold his palace. After Shaka-Shari's death around 2193 BCE, the Sumerian king list records one of the most remarkable phrases in ancient historiography after his name. It simply asks, who was king? Who was not king? Then it lists 4 names. Igi nanum imi alulu, as though all 4 claimed the throne simultaneously, which they probably did. The empire had fractured into civil war. And into this vacuum from the Zagros Mountains to the northeast came the Gutians. Here is the central methodological problem with studying the Gutian period, and I want you to hold it in your mind for the entire video. We have no Gutian texts, not one, no royal inscriptions, no administrative records, no literature, no religious texts. Nothing written by a Gutian in their language, from their perspective, has ever been found. Every single piece of textual evidence about the Gutians was written by Mesopotamians, people who were, at various points, their subjects, their enemies, or their ideological successors. When you're studying history through the eyes of only one side, you need to be very, very careful. The Gutians originated in the Zagros Mountains, the massive range that forms the border between modern Iraq and Iran, running through what is now Kurdistan and western Iran. Akkadian texts mention them before the empire's collapse, typically as raiders or hostile forces operating in the highlands. An inscription of Naram-Sin himself describes campaigns against Gutian territories, suggesting they had been a persistent irritant to the empire for years before they ever dominated it. Most scholars characterize them as semi-nomadic pastoralists, people whose primary economy was herding sheep and goats, moving seasonally between mountain pastures and lowland areas. This was a common lifestyle pattern across the ancient Near Eastern highlands, and it meant the Gutians were mobile, experienced in rugged terrain, and practiced fighters. Their language remains completely unknown. The Sumerian king list preserves a list of Gutian royal names: Inkashush, Zarlagab, Shom, Silyalumish, and so on, but these names don't match any known language family with confidence. Some scholars have proposed links to Hurrian or other languages of the region, but this remains speculation. We simply don't know. Now let's look at how Mesopotamian texts describe the Gutians with critical eyes. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2000 BCE, over a century after the Gutian period ended, calls them the army of Gutium, a people who knows no inhibitions. The phrase "knows no inhibitions" is a recurring formula in Mesopotamian literature for foreigners who don't follow proper civilized norms. The literary composition known as the Curse of Akkad, written during the Ur III period that followed Gutian dominance, is the most extreme. It describes Gutians as a people who know no inhibitions, with human instincts but canine intelligence and monkey features. It portrays them eating raw meat, behaving like animals, terrorizing cities. I want to be direct about what this language is. It is not ethnography. It is not even hostile journalism. It is a systematic dehumanization of an enemy, using a literary vocabulary that ancient Mesopotamians developed specifically for constructing the barbaric other, the uncivilized foreigner who by contrast defines the civilized self. Romans did this to Germanic peoples. Greek writers did it to Persians. Medieval chroniclers did it to Vikings. Chinese historians did it to the steppe nomads. This is one of the oldest rhetorical strategies in the history of writing, and we should be no more inclined to take it literally in Mesopotamia than we would anywhere else. As the Assyriologist Piotr Mikulovsky has argued, the Gutians of the textual tradition are largely a literary construct, assembled from stereotypes and ideological needs, not from observation. So if the texts can't be taken at face value, how do we find the historical Gutians? We look at what the ground actually tells us. The traditional narrative describes the Gutian takeover as an invasion and military conquest that brought foreign rule and cultural obliteration to the Mesopotamian heartland. If that's what happened, the archaeological record should show it clearly. Invasions and conquests leave marks. They leave destruction layers, burnt buildings, smashed pottery, signs of violent assault at site after site. They leave breaks in material culture, where one pottery tradition is suddenly replaced by another. If a significant foreign population settles, they bring their own ceramic traditions, their own burial customs, their own architectural styles. The Gutians period shows none of this. Systematic archaeological surveys across southern Mesopotamia, particularly the landmark work of Robert McAdams in the Dajala region, reveal a consistent pattern. Major urban centers like Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, and Oma show continuous occupation across the Akkadian to Gutian transition. There is no synchronized destruction horizon at circa 2154 BCE. The cities kept functioning. Pottery sequences, our most reliable indicator of population continuity or change, show gradual stylistic evolution at sites like Nippur and Adab, not sudden replacement. If a new population with its own ceramic traditions had moved in, we would see it. We don't. Burial customs show no change. Cylinder seals, the small carved stones used to authenticate documents, continue Akkadian iconographic traditions. The same deities, the same mythological scenes, the same compositional formats. There is stylistic development, as there always is, but no rupture. We do see some settlement, abandonment, particularly at smaller sites in marginal agricultural zones. But this pattern begins before the Gutian period and correlates far more strongly with the climate event than with any conquest. People were retreating from drying land. That's an ecological response, not a consequence of invasion. What the evidence actually supports is something considerably less dramatic than conquest. A system of tribute extraction by a relatively small number of Gutian warrior chiefs who imposed political dominance over existing Mesopotamian cities without fundamentally transforming them. Think of it this way. The Gutians were not Romans building an empire with roads, provinces, and legions. They were more analogous to Viking warlords in 9th century England, extracting tribute and providing a degree of military protection, while local Anglo-Saxon administration carried on largely unchanged underneath. Administrative tablets from this period, fewer than during the height of the Akkadian Empire, certainly but not absent, continue to be written in Sumerian by Mesopotamian scribes. They record grain distributions, temple offerings, labor assignments, commercial transactions. The machinery of Mesopotamian economic life kept turning, and there's a crucial issue with the Sumerian king list's presentation of Gutian rule. The list gives us 21 Gutian rulers with a total of approximately 91 years of kingship, but the list presents these rulers sequentially, one after another, as though they ruled in succession. Scholars, including Douglas Frayne, have argued persuasively that at least some of these rulers were probably contemporary, controlling different regions simultaneously rather than succeeding one another. If that's correct, then Gutian dominance wasn't even a unified dominance. It was a patchwork of different chiefs controlling different territories with varying degrees of effectiveness. While some areas of Mesopotamia, particularly in the far south, may have remained functionally independent throughout. This brings us to the most powerful piece of evidence against the Dark Age narrative. A man who should not have been able to exist if that narrative were true. Meet Gutian, governor of the city-state of Lagash. He ruled for approximately 20 years, probably between 2144 and 2124 BCE, right in the middle of the Gutian period. More than 20 statues of Gutian survive. They are carved from diorite, one of the hardest stones known to the ancient world, imported from Megan, in what is now Oman, thousands of kilometers away. The carving is extraordinary, the smooth finish, the serene expression, the precise rendering of textiles and cuneiform inscriptions. These are masterpieces of Mesopotamian sculpture. They represent the work of skilled craftsmen operating in a prosperous, stable, sophisticated urban environment. That environment, to be absolutely clear, existed during the supposed Dark Age. Gutian also left us the Gutian cylinders, 2 large clay cylinders, inscribed with more than 1,300 lines of Sumerian text describing the construction of the Temple of Ningasu, the city's patron deity. This is some of the longest, most sophisticated Sumerian literature we possess. It contains complex poetry, detailed theological discourse, architectural descriptions, accounts of divine visions. It is not the product of a civilization in collapse. Gutian's inscriptions tell us he built or restored at least 15 temples during his reign. He imported cedar from the Amanus Mountains in what is now southern Turkey. Gold and silver came from trading connections that reached Egypt and Anatolia. Copper came from Megan and Oman. Diorite from the Gulf, timber from the Zap. Long-distance international trade, massive construction projects, high literary production, exceptional sculptural artistry during the Dark Age. Now, here is the detail that historians have found most striking and most revealing. In all of Gutian's extensive inscriptions covering temple construction, military campaigns, trade expeditions, divine visions, and administrative activities, he never mentions the Gutians once. Not once. He claims his authority comes directly from the gods. He presents himself as an independent ruler, answerable only to Ningasu and the Divine Assembly. He does not describe paying tribute to foreign overlords. He does not acknowledge any external political constraint on his actions. This silence is evidence. It tells us one of several things, and scholars have debated which. It may mean Lagash was entirely outside Gutian control. The city sat in the far south of Mesopotamia, and if Gutian dominance was primarily centered on northern and central regions, Lagash may have been functionally independent throughout. It may mean Gutian paid some form of tribute to Gutian chiefs but regarded this as politically irrelevant to his self-presentation as a divinely mandated temple builder. Ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions consistently filter reality through theological frameworks. What matters is what the gods decreed, not the political negotiations underneath. It may mean Gutian presence in his region was so minimal and unintrusive that there was genuinely nothing to report. What it cannot mean, what the existence of Gutian himself makes impossible, is that the Gutian period was a catastrophic collapse of Mesopotamian civilization. You do not commission 20 masterpiece sculptures and construct 15 temples during a civilizational catastrophe. Lagash was not an exception to the rule. It was the rule, made visible through unusually rich evidence. Administrative tablets from Omagursu and other southern cities confirm ongoing economic activity throughout this period. The reduction in tablets compared to the peak of Akkadian imperial administration reflects political fragmentation, not civilizational death. Let's now go through our primary textual sources systematically and examine each one with the critical rigor it deserves. Source 1. The Sumerian King List. The Sumerian King List is our most systematic account of Gutian rulers. It names 21 kings, assigns reign lengths ranging from 40 days to 15 years, and gives a total reign of approximately 91 years. But we need to understand what this document actually is. It's a literary theological composition, not a historical chronicle. Its purpose is to demonstrate the divine transfer of kingship, The idea that legitimate rulership was a single torch passed from city to city by the gods. It was compiled around 2000 BCE, well over a century after the Gutian period ended, under the Isin dynasty, which had its own ideological interest in the narrative. Multiple manuscript versions survive, and they differ from each other in significant ways, in the names recorded, in the reign lengths assigned, in minor details. This textual instability suggests we're dealing with a tradition that was developed and modified over time, not a single document faithfully preserving original records. The suspicious uniformity of many reign lengths, several kings given exactly 6 years, suggests the compilers were working with incomplete information and filling gaps with round numbers. We should treat the specific figures with caution. Source 2. The Curse of Akkad. The Curse of Akkad is a Sumerian literary composition written during the Ur III period. It tells the story of how Naram-Sin, the great Akkadian king, brought divine punishment upon himself and his empire by plundering the Eka, the sacred temple complex of Enlil and Nippur. In response, Enlil unleashed the Gutians as instruments of divine wrath. This is sophisticated literature, genuinely so. It's not crude propaganda but a complex theological narrative with real literary merit, but that makes it no more reliable as history. The Gutians in this composition are a literary device, not a portrait. They serve to explain imperial collapse through the lens of divine justice. Akkad sinned, so the gods sent the barbarians. The Gutians' actual nature, culture, and motivations are entirely irrelevant to this framework. The text was composed by Ur III scribes to serve Ur III purposes, to explain why the most powerful empire in history had fallen, in terms that preserved a theological principle of divine order while positioning the Ur III restoration as the righteous conclusion to the story. Source 3. The victory inscription of Utuhegel. Utuhegel, king of Uruk, defeated the last Gutian ruler, a man named Tirigan, around 2119 BCE. His victory inscription, known from later Babylonian copies, is our main account of this event. The text describes Enlil choosing Utuhegel to liberate Sumer from the serpent and scorpion of the mountains. When Utuhegel marches against Tirigan, the Gutian army dissolves without fighting, abandoning their king. Tirigan flees to a city called Dabrum, where the local population captures him and hands him over. Utuhegel performs the ritual gesture of placing his foot on Tirigan's neck. Total submission in Gutian rule ends. Almost every element of this narrative follows standard ancient Near Eastern victory inscription conventions. Divine selection of the hero, the enemy's forces collapsing due to lost legitimacy, humiliating capture rather than honorable defeat in battle. This doesn't mean the events didn't happen. Utuhegel probably did defeat a Gutian chief named Tirigan, but the inscription tells us almost nothing about the actual scale of the conflict or the real nature of Gutian power. Source 4. Administrative tablets, our most direct and least ideologically mediated evidence. These are the day-to-day business records of Mesopotamian temples and administrations. Grain allocations, labor assignments, land transactions, livestock counts. The number of surviving tablets dropped significantly during the Gutian period compared to the height of Akkadian imperial administration. But this is almost certainly a reflection of reduced centralization, not economic collapse. The Akkadian Empire required enormous quantities of records to coordinate a vast imperial system. Without that empire, you need fewer records. The tablets that do survive from this period, particularly from Lagash and surrounding sites, document ongoing economic activity at a local level. These are the records that tell us civilizational life continued. When we synthesize these four source types, a clear pattern emerges. Texts written during or close to the Gutian period document continuity and local prosperity. Texts written a generation or more later, under the Ur III dynasty, construct a narrative of barbaric catastrophe and righteous liberation. The Dark Age was not experienced, it was invented, retrospectively, to serve a political purpose. Around 2119 BCE, Utuhegel of Uruk emerges as the dominant force in southern Mesopotamia. The Gutian period ends not with a dramatic mass expulsion, The evidence suggests Gutian power was already fragmenting by this point, but with the defeat of one particular chief, Tirigan, who may have controlled only a portion of what had once been Gutian-dominated territory. Utuhigel's victory inscription inflates this into total liberation. This is expected. This is what ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions do. He was building a new political order and needed founding mythology. But Utuhigel's reign lasted only about 7 years. The Sumerian king list records his death with a terse, almost suspicious economy of words. He was carried off by a flood while inspecting a canal. Whether this was an accident or something more deliberately arranged, we cannot say. What we can say is that the timing benefited his immediate successor enormously. Ur-Nammu, who had served as Utuhigel's military governor in the city of Ur, seized power around 2112 BCE and founded what we call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur III. What followed was one of the most remarkable periods of institutional development in ancient Mesopotamian history. Ur-Nammu built the Great Ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved monuments of the ancient world. He promulgated the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest surviving law code, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries. His son Shulgi created a bureaucratic state of extraordinary complexity, with standardized weights and measures, a reformed calendar, a professional army, and an administrative system so documented that we have hundreds of thousands of tablets from this dynasty. The Ur III dynasty needed a founding narrative, and the founding narrative they chose developed through royal inscriptions, literary compositions, and the retrospective editing of king lists was liberation from barbarian oppression. The darker the Gutian interlude, the brighter the Ur III restoration. Every composition that portrayed the Gutians as subhuman monsters simultaneously portrayed Ur-Nammu and Shulgi as civilizational saviors. It was excellent politics, and it worked. The Gutian Dark Age narrative was transmitted through subsequent Babylonian literary tradition and ultimately into the foundation of modern Assyria. The Gutians themselves retreated to the Zagros Mountains. They appear occasionally in later texts as raiders or frontier peoples, but they never again held political dominance in Mesopotamia. Gradually they fade entirely from the historical record, leaving us nothing in their own voice. The Gutian case is not unusual. It fits a pattern that repeats across multiple civilizations, multiple time periods, and multiple historiographical traditions. The Germanic migrations into the late Roman Empire were characterized by Roman sources, Ammianus, Marcellinus, Procopius, Jordanes, as catastrophic barbaric invasion that destroyed classical civilization. Modern archaeology tells a considerably different story: gradual migration, extensive cultural fusion, continuation of Roman institutions and administrative practices under Germanic rulers. The Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410 CE, were Arian Christians who wore Roman military uniforms and administered Roman tax systems. The barbarian invasion was far more complicated than that phrase implies. The Viking raids in England and Ireland were documented almost exclusively by monastic chroniclers whose monasteries were being raided. Naturally, those chroniclers emphasized destruction and paganism. Archaeology reveals trading networks. Urban development. Dublin was a Viking foundation, extensive cultural exchange, and relatively rapid integration into Christian political culture. The Danelaw was not an occupation zone, it was a zone of cultural fusion. In each case, the same structure appears. Hostile sources portray foreign newcomers as subhuman barbarians. Material evidence reveals more continuity, more complexity, more mutual influence than those sources allow. And later dynasties or political orders shaped the narrative to maximize their own legitimacy. The Dark Ages concept itself, the very concept of a historical Dark Age, deserves examination. The European Dark Ages, roughly the 5th through 10th centuries CE, were so named by Renaissance humanists who idealized classical antiquity and experienced the medieval period as a regrettable interruption of human progress. Modern medieval scholarship has spent decades systematically dismantling this characterization. The period saw significant technological development, the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge through the Islamic world and Irish monasteries, the emergence of complex feudal legal systems, and extraordinary artistic achievement in Romanesque and early Gothic architecture. The Greek Dark Age following the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE was characterized as cultural regress. Recent scholarship has revised this, recognizing the period as one of transformation and adaptation, including the development of the Greek alphabet from Phoenician script that laid foundations for the classical civilization that followed. Dark Age is a description of our evidence, not necessarily of historical reality. When sources are few, we call the period dark. When archaeology illuminates it, we find it was rather more inhabited and active than the darkness suggested. The Gutian period fits this pattern exactly. It is dark primarily because the Ur-3 dynasty had no interest in preserving Gutian records, and because the Gutians themselves left us nothing. The darkness is in our archives, not in the ancient Mesopotamian sky. Academic understanding of the Gutian period has shifted substantially over the past half-century, driven by three main developments. First, the expansion of systematic archaeological survey work, beginning with Robert McAdams' pioneering surveys in the Dejala region in the 1960s and 1970s, and continuing through subsequent work by scholars like Henry Wright and their collaborators. We now have extensive settlement pattern data that simply didn't exist when earlier generations of Assyriologists built the foundational interpretive framework. That data consistently contradicts the catastrophic collapse model. Second, increasingly sophisticated methodological tools for analyzing ancient texts. A generation of scholars, Piotr Mikołowski, Douglas Frame, Piotr Stinkler, Benjamin Foster, and others have developed rigorous frameworks for distinguishing royal propaganda from historical documentation, for understanding the ideological functions of literary genres, and for reading ancient texts as products of specific political contexts rather than transparent windows onto the past. Third, the growth of interdisciplinary approaches. Harvey Weiss's paleoclimatic work brought environmental science into direct conversation with ancient history. The result was a fundamentally different causal model. Climate disaster drove the Akkadian collapse. Gutian dominance was an opportunistic consequence of that collapse, not its cause. The current scholarly consensus across these lines of evidence and interpretive development, a revised picture has emerged. It can be summarized this way. The Gutian period was not a dark age of barbaric destruction and cultural collapse. It was a period of political fragmentation, following an ecological crisis, during which small Gutian warrior elites extracted tribute from Mesopotamian cities, while those cities continued to function, economically, culturally, institutionally, largely as they always had. Some cities, Lagash most visibly, actually flourished. The Dark Age narrative is a retrospective construction, assembled by the Ur-3 dynasty and transmitted through subsequent Babylonian literary tradition to serve the ideological needs of political legitimacy. Important questions remain genuinely open. The exact chronology is contested. The 91-year figure from the king list is likely inflated, but the corrected duration is debated. The geographic extent of Gutian control remains unclear. Some scholars think it covered most of Mesopotamia at its height. Others argue it was primarily concentrated in central and northern regions, with the south remaining substantially autonomous. The ethnic and cultural identity of the Gutians, whether they were a single coherent people or a loose confederation of highland groups, is unknown and may be unknowable. These uncertainties are real, but they don't restore the traditional narrative. They leave us with a picture that is genuinely more interesting. Not a simple story of barbaric invasion and civilizational collapse, but a complex, partially obscured episode of political transformation, in which the peoples we've been told were the destroyers of civilization may have had far less impact on it than their conquerors claimed. The Gutians remain mysterious. We do not know their language, we do not know their religion or their origin stories or how they understood themselves. We do not know what name they called themselves in their own tongue. They exist in our historical memory only as they were constructed by the civilization they briefly dominated, and that civilization had every reason to make them look as monstrous as possible. But here is what we do know, and what I think the Gutian case teaches us more broadly about how history works. The victors write the history. This is such a familiar observation that it has become a cliché. But clichés are usually clichés because they're true. The Ur-3 dynasty needed a founding myth. They needed the period before them to be dark so that their own restoration could be light. They had the scribes, the resources, and the institutional power to build that narrative into the literary tradition, and they did so effectively enough that historians were still accepting it largely at face value 2,000 years later. Material evidence is not neutral, but it is differently biased. Pottery doesn't have a political agenda. Settlement patterns don't propagandize. Cylinder seals don't construct founding myths. When archaeology consistently contradicts the textual narrative, we should be willing to revise the narrative rather than explain away the archaeology. The concept of a dark age almost always tells us more about our sources than about historical reality. Periods are dark when we have few sources. When we develop new tools, paleoclimatology, systematic survey, archaeology, rigorous textual criticism, the darkness frequently gives way to something considerably more complex. And perhaps most importantly, the absence of a voice in the historical record does not mean the absence of an experience worth understanding. The Gutians lived. They had a culture, a language, a way of making sense of the world. That world is lost to us, almost entirely, because the people who outlasted them had no interest in preserving it. That loss is not trivial. It is a reminder of how much of the human past has simply vanished, not because it wasn't there, but because no one with power and resources thought it worth keeping. The next time someone tells you about a historical dark age, whether it's ancient Mesopotamia or post-Roman Europe or anywhere else, ask who gets to define the darkness and who had the power to keep the lights on. This man Gudea of Lagash carved in the hardest stone the ancient world knew, his face serene and composed, was created in a dark age. Make of that what you will, if you made it to the end of this one. Thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of history that takes some patience, because it requires us to question the story before we can understand the reality. And that's not always a comfortable process. If you found this useful, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who would find it interesting, a student, a teacher, anyone with a curiosity about the ancient world and how we know what we think we know. In the description below, I've put together a reading list, the key primary sources in translation, the foundational secondary literature, and some of the more recent revisionist scholarship that inform this video. If you want to go deeper, that's where to start. I read every comment that comes in. And I'm particularly curious about this. Which other historical periods do you think deserve the kind of critical re-examination we gave the Gutians today? The Bronze Age collapse, the Mongol Empire, early medieval Europe? Let me know below. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.